What prophecies will be fulfilled between now and Ezekiel 38? Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Welcome, friends. This is David Schnitker, your host for today's program. Thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with Bible prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You will find a donate link on the home page. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thank you for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. It is a great privilege to have Bill Salas back on the program today to continue discussing his brand new DVD entitled The Prophetic Mideast Wars. In fact, this DVD is so current, I don't even have a copy of it to show you. I'll be receiving it in the next few days. And so, friends, you'll be among the first to receive this brand new teaching video. At the end of today's show, we will tell you how you can obtain this excellent prophetic resource. Bill is one of the leading prophecy scholars and writers and filmmakers in our country today, in our world today, and is a headliner at prophecy conferences across America. I've had the privilege of sitting under his ministry and hearing him at prophecy conferences, such as the excellent annual Prophecy Watchers Conference, which I believe Bill will be at in October, Lord willing. God has given Bill an ability to understand Bible prophecy and relate it to the events taking place in our world today. And on today's program, we want to continue talking about the prophecies that are near-term prophecies, and we're going to shift our focus. Last week we were talking about the annexation of the West Bank that is being negotiated in the days in which we live and may actually come to fruition between today of our taping and the airing of this program. But today we want to shift our focus a little bit and talk about prophecies that we can expect to be fulfilled between now and Ezekiel 38. These are prophecies which Bill has described in his book, The Now Prophecies, as prophecies that do not have pre-qualifications. In other words, they are prophecies that could take place today without intervening pre-qualifying events. So what we're talking about today in a summary fashion are what we would call now prophecies, things that may take place in the very near future leading up to the marquee event of Ezekiel 38, which is a next prophecy. So we're going to be just looking at some of the prophecies that could take place now and in the near future. We have a lot to cover, Bill, and it's unfair for me to ask you so many questions in such a brief period of time, but we'll just begin with a summary question, and that is, how do we get from now, we're talking about July 2020, the year we would like, all of us would like to cancel, but we're only halfway through. So I hope it gets better, but I don't expect that it will. So how do we get from now to Ezekiel 38?
Right, and that's really a critically important question, because Ezekiel 38 is a major marquee event. It's the event God has chosen to stop this formidable advance of Russia, Turkey, Iran, and a coalition of 8 or 9 members are going to come down against Israel. And God's going to stop it, not the Israeli Defense Forces, not the American troops. He's going to do it with a great earthquake, fire, great hailstone, and brimstone, fire and brimstone. So, and it's going to say, I'm going to make my holy name known in the midst of my people, Israel. They shall not profane it anymore. The nation shall know I'm the Lord. He's chosen that event to put the world on official notice of the holy name of the Lord again. Mm-hmm. So, and the reason this is really critically important to talk about, how do we get from here to there, is because we're seeing Ezekiel 38 formulating right now. It seems to be, if you talk to most of our prophecy colleagues, they're all sort of in the back of their mind wondering how close is Ezekiel 38 to coming, because you see the relationships that Russia's developing with Iran. They're building nuclear power plants inside of Iran. They've helped them with the Bashar 1. They're building the Bashar 2 and Bashar 3. Supposed to be done with all those by 2026. They're building relationships with Turkey, even though there's some schism. Turkey, they're putting forward a nuclear facility inside of Turkey. They're going to sell them the S-400 missile defense system. So we're seeing these relationships cement together, and they're probably not going to become unglued. And so we start thinking, well, gee, this looks like Ezekiel 38. This looks like Ezekiel 38.
But this could happen now.
But the problem is there's some prerequisites in Ezekiel 38 that that doesn't make it could happen now at the present time. They have to be dwelling securely in the land without walls, bars, nor gates, and they have in unwalled villages, and have to be in receipt of this enormous amount of plunder and booty. That's what Russia's coming after, the plunder and booty.
And that certainly does not describe Israel today, does it?
No, I don't believe it does. There's walls to the north between Lebanon and Israel. That's why Hezbollah is digging tunnels underneath to get in. Hamas, the same thing, digging tunnels under. There's walls between Jordan and Israel. There's walls down by Egypt to Sinai. And there's a partition wall that goes 403+ miles inside of Israel proper. And there are checkpoints and security checkpoints. And
it's the most secure country in the world, isn't it?
The most fenced and fortified nation in the world, really. So for various reasons, I would say it's drawing near, but it's not now. It's next.
Well, as we talk about and think about the Ezekiel 38 coalition, of course, there are several participants, and we'll just mention one. One is Persia, ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. But there's also a separate prophecy related to Elam, which most folks today don't know what that is, but that's also part of modern-day Iran territorially.
Right.
Can you explain Iran's dual prophecies of Elam, Jeremiah 49, and Persia, Ezekiel 38?
Right. It's interesting because clearly Ezekiel wrote about Persia, which was Persia until 1935, and then it was renamed Iran. So we don't have any problem pinning the tail on who Persia represents. It's Iran, modern-day Iran. However, when Ezekiel wrote about 2,500 years ago, his contemporary Jeremiah wrote actually prior to Ezekiel, Jeremiah probably wrote this around 596 BC. He wrote about Elam. He has a prophecy in Elam in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39. And so when you look at a modern-day map of Iran, about a quarter of it is Elam, which hugs the western side of Iran, hugs the Persian Gulf, and the other three-fourths, roughly, is Persia. So it's predominantly there, but they're separated by this geographical national boundary of the Zagros Mountains. And that's important to note because Elam is a subject of a prophecy that's probably nuclear. But it doesn't necessarily take out all of Persia because they still got to be around to be involved in Ezekiel 38. And they're not the same prophecy. I have a book called Nuclear Showdown in Elam.
Now,
back in the DVD,
can I
talk about this.
interject this just so I understand your assumptions? You think that the nuclear war with Elam may take place prior to the Ezekiel 38?
I do.
Okay.
In fact, I think this is the thing I'm watching for the most because Iran is, moving full speed ahead now. We've backed out of that joint comprehensive plan of action. Iran is re-enriching uranium again at much higher and faster levels, more efficiently. So they're en route to get a nuclear weapon, and they're even having trouble with the Atomic Energy, the UN agency trying to get in there and monitor it.
Now, would you say that Israel and the United States are determined not to allow that to happen?
Yeah, that's one of Benjamin Netanyahu's promises. They will not have a nuclear weapon while he's in office. So the thing is with that prophecy is that it seems to talk about a nuclear disaster that when it gets hit, it says there'll be enemies at the time that Iran has. What happens, I'll just say it real quickly in this prophecy, I can summarize it pretty quickly. It talks about a time when the Lord would be really fiercely angry with the leadership of Iran. And I believe that time has come right now. And he's angry with them because it says he's going to kill the kings and princes in this area because they want to launch something lethal somewhere. It says God's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of its might. He's not going to allow them to accomplish whatever their plan is to launch something somewhere. And it says when he does that, the indigenous population are actually going to have to scatter into the nations of the world. There'll be no nation while the outcasts of Elam do not go.
So this will be a severe judgment.
Severe judgment, it says, I will bring forward a disaster because of my fierce anger. That's what the Lord says. So he provokes it. But it looks like it's a military invasion because it says, I will consume them with the sword, and they'll be dismayed before their enemies, plural. And Iran has enemies. They've got Israel, America, Saudi Arabia, international communities concerned about Iran. So all the ingredients are present. Again, there's no prerequisites for this prophecy. But the thing is, it sounds like a humanitarian crisis happens. And now the point being is if Iran gets hit, and let's say Israel's involved, and we're not told who is involved, but I'm going to have to suggest it could be America and or Israel under circumstances of today. Is Iran going to take one for the team, or are they going to call their proxies Hezbollah, Syria, Hamas, the Houthis down in Yemen, and parts of Iraq, which has now gone Shiite and supporting Iran? Are they going to all come against Israel? Is that going to be the thing that catalyzes these other things that can happen? I think so. And I think that's when you get to a position where Israel is now in an all-out prison rules fight with not only Iran, but their enemies around them, and there's no shortage of prophecies of Israel.
And think about the time frame of that might make this a bit more imminent. Not that we can put a date on it, but as we talked about in our last program, the Prime Minister of Israel has a fairly short shelf life, 18 months before he has to share power with the other coalition leader. We have an American president whose future is uncertain as it relates to re-election. So with these two men in power, both who have been very clear in their opposition to Iran's nuclear ambitions, this could place this on the front burner, this possibility of the nuclear war with Iran.
That's right. Because several things happen if Trump doesn't get reelected. Then Israel's got to buddy up with whoever the Democratic winner would be, and at this point, that could be Joe Biden.
Right. And he was a participant in the Iranian deal, the payoff deal, under the Obama administration.
That's right.
So you kind of know what his stance toward Iran is going to be.
And he's come against the annexation plans of Israel and that sort of thing. So you've got a couple things in play there. One is they want to move forward with annexation if they do it while Trump is in office, not run the risk he won't be reelected. On the other hand, they also don't want to be dealing with a soft pedaling around Iran with the new administration, when right now they've got the full support of Trump in that, if they had to go forward in an invasion.
So both of these issues could be front burner because of the tenuous nature of American and Israeli leadership right now. Interesting. Well, we talk about Iran in rather negative ways, of course, very obvious ways. The Iranian Revolution in the 1970s, 1979, Iranian people have suffered horrendous, trials, persecution, etc., under the mullahs, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, God is doing something really amazing in Iran, and we want to encourage our people that God works even in the worst of circumstances. So share with us, Bill, why has Iran become the fastest growing evangelical nation in the world?
That is the backstory. That's the bigger backstory.
And you don't hear about that in the secular press either.
No, you don't. And I'll tell you what, there are a lot of Iranians who are actually very excited about what the Bible has to say about their future. And what I mean by that is not because of Ezekiel 38, because that's not a good prophecy for the Iranians, but the Elam prophecy we talked about talks about this disaster, but it also has some very good encouragement in the last two verses. It says, the Lord says, I will set my throne in Elam. That's a positive thing. And I will bring back the captives of Elam, the ones that were dispersed, and restore their fortunes. So you're seeing actually, there's a ministry that's very effective called Iran Alive Ministries. Hormoz Shariat, Dr. Hormoz Shariat, he's known as, Joel Rosenberg calls him the Billy Graham of Iran. He has a satellite TV show. I've been on it many times. I teach in English and they translate in Farsi. But the thing is, what they're encouraged because they're understanding God has a future for them. Now, meanwhile, God is doing supernatural evangelism over there. And Iran is growing at a rate of just under 20% per year. It's the highest, fastest evangelical growing country in the world.
That's amazing.
But it's not because there's missionaries over there. It's because missionaries are hard to get in there at this point. And Khomeini shut down when Ahmadinejad was the president. They shut down home churches. They persecute pastors. They imprison you even if you're just a believer in Jesus Christ at this point. So it's not because of the missionary movement. It's because God supernaturally is creating dreams, visions, miracles and healings, which is, to their culture, is something that they actually expect and respond to. That does it's not alien to them. And so they're coming in groves, and the stories are incredible. I mean, I know one of the pastors of the head of the underground church over there. He's got stories that would be amazing. Unfortunately, we don't have time in this show to go over that aspect. But so Hormoz Shariat's mission statement, based on Jeremiah 49 verses 38 and 39, is transforming Iran into a Christian nation in this generation. And that has got a lot of Iranians excited because they're so persecuted. Allah is doing nothing for them, you know, and so they're giving Christ a shot, and they're having a dream, you know. So there's one of the curriculums they have. I can kind of say this relatively quickly. What happens is they'll get people who would actually be invited into a family home, and they would start talking to them about Adam and Eve. Because the Muslims understand Adam and Eve, right? The next week, they'll be able to come back, and more family members are now coming into the home. And they'll start talking about Noah. And they'll, okay, you know, they haven't mentioned Jesus yet. Okay, and then the third week, more people are starting to come back because they're here and getting kind of excited about the teaching. It's a good thing to do. And by that time, someone's had a miracle, dream, vision, or healing. Now all of a sudden, when they come back, there's something important just happened. We just had a miracle. You know, someone who was dying is just, you know, whatever the case may be, or had a dream about Jesus or whatever. Now they talk about Abraham, he's a patriarch of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, right? He was the father of Ishmael, sort of the father of the Arabs and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So now, by the time they get through this series of events, the group's growing. He hasn't mentioned Jesus yet. Someone's had some sort of a supernatural event happen. They're sitting at the edge of their seat, and Jesus gets announced, and almost to a man and woman, they all accept Christ by I think it's like the 6th lesson. And now all of a sudden, they become an underground home church. That process is happening as we speak right now.
Wow, it's a real multiplication process.
It is.
And Jesus himself is showing up in healings and supernatural wonders.
That's right.
That testify to his deity.
That's right.
Wow.
So and that shows you the heart of God. He's rolling up his sleeve, and he's getting the job done, supernaturally, because he wishes that none would perish.
And possibly that makes the Iranian leadership even more desperate to do something violent.
That's right.
You know,
every time Christianity starts to burgeon somewhere, they try to persecute it, and they're doing that heavily with the Iranians right now.
Well, let's shift our focus a little bit southward now and move down to Syria. And Syria is the subject of prophecy, particularly in Damascus, the world's oldest inhabited city. And so there's a scripture passage in the Old Testament that talks about the destruction of Damascus. How does that happen?
Well, we're told it is done by the Israeli Defense Forces. So I know the verses, I'll just say them real quickly. I think, let's just play the scenario out. Iran comes under attack. Maybe the alarm prophecy starts to manifest. Iran calls upon their proxies Hezbollah to the north with 150,000 roughly missiles pointed at Israel, some precision guided. Calls on Syria with their chemical weapons. They use the chemical weapons over 300 times this was an NPR news article, came out 300 times during their Syrian revolution. Hamas can lob 1,000 missiles a day, they say, into Israel, so can Hezbollah. So all of a sudden, Iran pulls out their tentacles with their proxies, and they start coming against Israel. Okay, Isaiah 17 says in the burden against Damascus, verse 1, that Damascus will be destroyed. It'll cease from being a city. It'll be a ruinous heap. It goes on to say in verse 9, as you follow it through, it says, in that day, his strong cities, not just Damascus, speaking about Syria in general, there shall be desolation caused by the children of Israel. So we find out who now is the perpetrator of the destruction of Damascus in that day, when Damascus is being destroyed. Verse 14 says, in that day, one night you'll see him, speaking of Damascus in the masculine pronoun, but in the morning he is no more. This is the portion of those who rob us and those who plunder us, meaning they're robbing and plundering. They're coming against Israel, right? But their response is Israel's taking out a city. Now, Israel's not going to take out Damascus unless they're coming under against a formidable assault. It's got to be sort of a prison rules fight, no holds barred. We got no choice. We got to take out your city.
So this is total war at this point. When they take out the capital city, this is total war.
It is. And along the trail from Isaiah 17 verse 1 to Isaiah 17 verse 9, you have Isaiah 17 4 verses 6, which says also in that day that this is all going on. It says, the glory of Jacob will fade, his flesh will wax lean. There'll be a severe shaking. It'll be like an olive tree, leaving only 2 olives in the uppermost branch and 5 or some olives in the fruitful bough. Now, the reason that's an important imagery, which is not good for Israel, his glory is fading, his flesh is waxing lean. And then in the DVD, I actually superimpose an olive tree on top of a map of Israel, and the uppermost branch represents northern Israel in the picture. Now, the olive tree is a very commonly found tree in Israel, and it can go up to 50 feet, and it can have over 500,000 olives on it. So what happens with the shaking, and the flesh is waxing lean, and there's only 2 olives left on the uppermost bough and 4 or 5 in the fruitful. What happened to the other 480-some thousand olives? I think Israel takes a severe hit, and when that happens, in the process of that, they take out Damascus. They go, no more of this, right? And when that happens, I think what you have is you have the other Arab countries around going, we got 2 issues here, folks. One is they just took out a major Arab city. Is Beirut next? Is Amman, Jordan next? Is Cairo next? Is Mecca next? And look at Israel now. They're wounded.
Right.
Well, let's protect our cities. Let's come together and
so
coalesce.
Maybe a moment of opportunity, as well as motivated by fear that they could be next.
That's right. This is the time and age where people have to start seizing opportunities. Right? Israel needs to seize the opportunity while Trump is in office. These guys might need to seize the opportunity when Israel's been knocked down to come after them. And they're justified in that thinking because another one of the prophecies that happens is another major city does go down, Amman, Jordan. It says in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 2, that there's a alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites. That would be Amman, Jordan. It says it'll be a desolate mound. It sounds like, and it's only a couple-hour drive from there to Damascus. And it says it'll be a desolate mound, and then Israel will take possession of its inheritance. So Israel takes them out. Israel moves on in, annexes portions of Jordan.
Of course, there's a rumor, and I think Israel's the only country that does not allow the international nuclear monitoring organization to count the number of nuclear weapons. But last I heard, rumor has it they have over 200 nuclear weapons.
That's their worst kept secret.
It's their worst kept, right. They want it known, but they don't want it too well known.
Right.
But obviously their Arab neighbors know. And so let's say if a nuclear attack on Damascus takes place and Damascus is reduced to a heap, the neighbors would know there's at least 199 other nukes that could have their name on it next.
That's right. And one nuke can take out one city.
Right.
At least.
Yes.
And if they do it in a sort of a sanitary way, if you can ever even use that word in that scenario, in other words, because Israel's just across the border from Damascus. So there's a way, a strategic nuclear detonation at a certain burst altitude, maybe I think it's like 45 miles up, I'm not exactly sure. You can actually take out the city underneath, and you will go down and have the potential for the mushroom cloud sweep. But like in Hiroshima, it dropped on close to ground level. It just sucked up all the dirt and particles and contaminated them and spread them across the region. Israel can't afford that. They don't have that luxury.
Right.
Now, if all of a sudden they take out a city without affecting themselves adversely in the aftermath, this justifiably the Arab countries would be going, wow. That happened overnight. What's to say that I'll wake up tomorrow and Amman, Jordan will be here?
Right, right. So in other words, this is our time to act. This may be our last opportunity, so we have to act in concert while Israel is weakened because of the Assyrian conflict and an exchange.
Yeah, so, and Syria, although I'm not so sure Damascus is part of Psalm 83, that prophecy, it could be independent and lead to Psalm 83. But you have this other prophecy dealing with Psalm 83 that includes Jordan, includes Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Philistia, where the Hamas are, the neighboring Arab states around Israel and the terrorist populations within them. And I think that might be when you find the fulfillment of that prophecy.
Well, I think it's in Zechariah that there's a statement that Jerusalem will be made a cup of trembling. And it's a rather cryptic, metaphorical type of thing. Do you think that idea of Jerusalem being a cup of trembling may come into play at this point in time with this expanding conflict with Israel's neighbors?
I do. That prophecy, here's what it says. It says, Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling, some translations, dizziness or intoxication, to the surrounding Arab nations. Not to the whole world, but just to the neighborhood. And it says, when they lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem. So it's an actual act, it's an attempt to actually lay siege on the area. Now, they've been they've had their doings with Jerusalem going forth ever since Israel's been a nation. You know, it was divided in 1949 with the Green Line, was recaptured by Israel in 1967, but they gave the control of the Temple Mount to Jordan. Jerusalem's the third holiest city in Islam, even though it's not mentioned once in the Quran. So Jerusalem is very important to the Muslims, especially the Arab Muslims around Israel there. So at some point, they actually come to try to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, and it doesn't work out good for them. And what it also says in the process, when we see this starting to develop and stuff, verse 3 talks about that Jerusalem will be a burdensome stone to all those who try to move it out of its place or divide it or whatever, right? And we see that our president's been trying to do this sort of thing. Trump just recently did not divide it, but unified it, you know, this sort of thing. So it's not a good picture for the international community in that time. And of course, the United Nations wants to divide it. The whole world wants to divide it.
Absolutely.
So it's sort of a warning. But then you get on down and it says, but when they laid siege on it, in Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 6, the response is this. He says, I will bring forward the captains or governors. Now the Hebrew word is elufim, and that is a modern-day term for a lieutenant commander in the Israeli Defense Forces. So it's the IDF. I will bring forward the IDF, and there'll be the battlefield will be like a fire pan in the woodpile. He says, and the IDF will be like a fiery torch. And the enemies around Israel that lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, they will be like sheaves. Now we know who's going to win that victory. And it says, and they shall be like sheaves and devour all the surrounding peoples, not the world, the surrounding peoples, on the right hand and on the left hand. Very descriptive, boxing in who we're talking about. And it said, but Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in its place, Jerusalem. So this is also part of the Israeli Defense Forces in action. Now all of a sudden you can have, after these types of things going on, Israel can tear down the walls. They can dwell securely without walls, bars, nor gates, because their enemies have been taken out by the IDF. Now you've set the stage for Ezekiel 38. You know,
they'll be dwelling safely, without walls, expansive. Now they have some booty, so to speak, that would be attractive to this larger outer coalition.
And they're annexing more territory. It says Israel will take possession of its inheritance in Jordan.
So you're saying that there is actually a prophetic role for the Israeli Defense Forces. They're not mentioned in that way, but it is Israel's defense forces that will be the ones who actually take out their nasty neighbors. In the Psalm 83.
It's in the DVD. I actually show the verses. The IDF shows up several times in biblical prophecy and in things that have not found fulfillment yet. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, when will that find fulfillment? Is that part of Ezekiel 38? No, not really. Because God stops that.
No, you don't see the IDF in Ezekiel 38, 39.
No, you don't. That's all God's show.
God takes care of that one himself.
That's right. And you don't see them active in the tribulation, because in the first half they have this pseudo-peace going on, as confirmed by the false covenant, Daniel 9:27. So they're actually, sort of dismantling things. Matter of fact, they can't even stop the Antichrist when he tries to go into the temple in the midpoint of the tribulation. So it doesn't show the Israeli Defense Forces in great power. And then in the second half of the tribulation, they're actually fleeing for their lives because there's a genocidal campaign being conducted.
So we
by
might
the
say, correct me if you have a differing view, that the apex of the Israeli Defense Forces' power is seen in the Psalm 83 victory and the taking down of Jordan, Amman, Damascus, etc. That seems to be perhaps the apex of the flexing of the IDF military muscle.
That's right. So we have in Ezekiel 37:10 our first hint about the Israeli Defense Forces. Ezekiel got this vision of this valley with all these dry bones, and you go through this really interesting prophecy, and it really does seem to be that Ezekiel was transported into the worst time of the Holocaust, right? Where the Jewish people, it says their hope is lost, their bones are dry, they feel themselves cut off. And God says to Ezekiel, prophesy to these bones. And he did, and they stood up, and sinews came on the bone, flesh on them, and ultimately down the road, God's going to breathe into them. But he says to them in the process, prophesy to them, and they stood up, an exceedingly great army. Slips that right in verse 10 in the prophecy. And you study the word that's used, it is actually dealing with an exceedingly great army. You can't really allegorize it.
It literally means an exceedingly great army.
So what he's saying there, and then it says, and then after that verse, in verse 11, and I will bring you out of the nations, out of your graves, and bring you back into the land. So remember, they came back in 1948. They were no exceedingly great army. It was a Haganah, ultimately burgeoned into the Israeli Defense Forces. And they survived a war with a few planes and some hand grenades.
Right, borrowed planes from France, I think.
That's right, against a massive Arab onslaught. So what you have right now is they've become, war after war after war, a great army. After Psalm 83, they'll become an exceedingly great army. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Wow. Last question for today, Bill. What is the fate of the Palestinians? We haven't talked about the Palestinians today. I'm not sure that they're mentioned specifically in the Psalm 83 coalition. What about the Palestinians?
Well, I do believe they're mentioned specifically in the Psalm 83. Psalm 83 has 10 belligerents, and the one listed very first and listed in a habitation condition is the tents of Edom. That biblically would represent refugees, typically. Tents.
Yeah, in tents.
So the Edomites have ethical representation in the Palestinians today. Not all Palestinians are Edomites, but they do have you can trace their lineage from Esau, who fathered the Edomites in Genesis 36, on down into the Palestinians today. They were the Idumeans back during the time of the Greeks, and then because some of them had moved over there out from southern Jordan, that's where Edom used to be, and lived over there in Hebron and that sort of thing. They became Idumea, they became the Idumeans. You can actually trace their lineage, and I do in some of my books, and I talk about them in the DVD that you've got. So they are there. Now, their fate is not good. We're told in Obadiah 1, verse 18, the house of Jacob will be a fire. Read that as the Israeli Defense Forces. The house of Joseph a flame. And it says that, but the descendants of Esau shall be stubble. And no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau. That takes you down to the Edomites, on down through to what portion of the Edomites are inside of the Palestinians today. Ezekiel 25:14 says, I will execute my vengeance by the hand of my people Israel, the IDF, on Edom. They shall know my fury, and they shall know my vengeance. So the Palestinians are backing out of this situation with the deal of the century. They won't even come to the bargaining table as we speak right now. They're being stubborn. They're holding out. They're going to find themselves in a war that is going to defeat their ancestors.
They cannot win.
It's going to take their whole lineage out.
So they could have won something through negotiations, but they refused.
Right.
And so God is saying that there is going to be a judgment upon them by the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces.
Right. So this is not because God is a meanie. This has nothing to do with that. This is what takes you back to God's foreign policy established in Genesis chapter 12:3. 4,000 years ago, when he said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, but I will curse those who curse you. Okay, now, what happened is, you follow Israel's history, there was always this curse for curse in kind, right? Pharaoh wanted to stop the Jews at the Red Sea, but Pharaoh's armies got stopped and drowned in the Red Sea.
Right.
You know, Haman wanted to hang Mordecai and kill all the Jews. Haman got hung in the gallows, etc. So you're going to find the Palestinians are not working with the Jews, they're not blessing the Jews, they're cursing the Jews. So curse for curse in kind. They will be cursed by the Jews. So the
very fate that they want to bring upon Israel through their one-state solution will end up in their utter destruction.
That's right. They're cursing Israel. And so that foreign policy is still effectively intact.
It's a dangerous thing to do. We've seen it through history.
That's right.
And we'll see it in the future, too.
That's right.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. It really has whet my appetite to viewing the video that will give a lot more in the way of details.
Yes, it will.
And so it's been a great privilege. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, David.
These two broadcasts. And friends, we have been talking with Bill Salas both last time and today regarding his brand new DVD entitled The Prophetic Mideast Wars, America and Israel versus Russia and Iran. This video is 1 hour and 10 minutes in length. It is a teaching video which is extremely relevant in light of the potential Israeli annexation of portions of the West Bank, as per the Peace to Prosperity part of Trump's Deal of the Century plan. By the time you receive this video, there may be subsequent events take place in regard to that annexation. So this is extremely timely as today's news. Well, you may obtain a copy of the Prophetic Mideast Wars for a gift of $15.95 plus $3 for shipping. To place your order, simply go to our website, www.swpm.us, and click on the Bookstore tab on the homepage. Enter the title of the DVD, The Prophetic Mideast Wars, and it will take you directly to the description for this video. The address again is www.swpm.us. Well, friends, thank you again for joining us for today's informative podcast. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Until then, this is your host, David Schnitker. Thanks for listening.